The Dhammapada. Chapter 20. Magga Vagga, the way, or the path. Verse 273. The Eightfold Path is the best. Maggan attangiko se to, satchanang chaturo pada, virago se to dhammanang, dipadanancha chakkuma. The best of paths is the Eightfold Path. The best of truths are the four sayings. Non-attachment is the best of states. The best of bipeds is the seeing one. A note from the author. The Eightfold Path is the middle way discovered by the Buddha for the realization of Nibbana. It consists of right understanding, sammaditthi, right thoughts, samma sankappa, right speech, samma vacha, right action, samma kammanta, right livelihood, samma ajiva, right effort, samma vayama, right mindfulness, samma sati, and right concentration, samma samadhi. This is the unique path of enlightenment. From a philosophical standpoint, these 8 factors are the 8 mental states found in the supramundane consciousness which has Nibbana for its object. Also, in reference to the 4 sayings mentioned in the verse, these are in reference to the 4 noble truths: suffering, the cause of suffering, the destruction of suffering, and the path leading to the destruction of suffering. The first truth of suffering is to be comprehended. The cause of suffering, which is craving, is to be eradicated. The destruction of suffering, which is Nibbana, is to be realized. The path leading to the destruction of suffering, which is the Eightfold Path, is to be developed. Whether the Buddhas arise or not, these 4 truths exist in the world. It is the Buddhas that reveal them to mankind. Verse 274. Follow this path for purity. Esova maggo natanyo, dasanassa visuddhiya, etam hi tumhe patipajjatha, marasetang pamohanang. This is the only way. There is none other for the purity of vision. Do follow this path, for this is the bewilderment of Mara. Verse 275. Follow this path to end suffering. Etam hi tumhe patipanna, dukkhasantang karissatha, akkato ve maya maggo, annaya salla santanang. Follow this way, you shall make an end of suffering. This verily is the way declared by me when I had learned to remove the arrow of suffering. Verse 276. You must exert yourselves. Tumhe hi kichang atappang, akkhataro tathagata, patipanna pamukhanti, jayino mara bandhana. You yourselves should make the effort. The Tathagatas are only teachers. Those who enter this path and who are meditative are delivered from the bonds of Mara. The path to perfection. A group of bhikkhus, after accompanying the Buddha to a village, returned to the Jetavana monastery. In the evening, they talked about the trip, especially the nature of the land, whether it was level or hilly, clayey or stony, etc. The Buddha came to them in the midst of their conversation and said to them, Bhikkhus, the path you are talking about is external to you. A bhikkhu should only be concerned with the path of the noble ones, the Aryas, and strive to do what should be done for the attainment of perfection that leads to the realization of perfect peace, of Nibbana. Verse 277. Transient are conditioned things. Sabbe sankhara anicchati yada panyaya passati atha nibbindati dukkhe esa maggo visuddhiya. All conditioned things are impermanent. When one sees this in wisdom, then one becomes dispassionate towards the painful. This is the path of purity. Meditation on anicca, or impermanence. A group of bhikkhus, after receiving their subject of meditation from the Buddha, went into the forest to practice meditation, but they made little progress. So they returned to the Buddha to ask for another subject of meditation which would suit them better. On reflection, the Buddha found that these bhikkhus had developed meditation on impermanence during the time of Kassapa Buddha. So he said, Bhikkhus, all component things are impermanent. A note from the author. All component things, whether animate or inanimate, are subject to the universal law of impermanency, unsatisfactoriness, and insubstantiality. No supernatural powers of God can change or stop this phenomenon. All our problems and unhappiness are rooted in our attachment towards momentary feelings or objects and uncertainty in everything. The conflict between our craving and impermanency creates unsatisfactoriness or physical or mental suffering. Those who can concentrate on this universal law can gain inner peace and contentment in life. Further, the Buddha is the first and only religious teacher who proclaimed that man can gain his own liberation without depending on any supernatural or external agency. Verse 278. Sorrowful are all conditioned things. Sabbe sankhara dukkhati yada panyaya passati atha nibbindati dukkhe esa maggo visuddhiya. All conditioned things are sorrowful. When one sees this in wisdom, then he becomes dispassionate towards the painful. This is the path to purity. Meditation on dukkha. The story is the same as the story on anicca. Here, the Buddha, on reflection, found that another group of bhikkhus had meditated on dukkha. So he said, Bhikkhus, all component things are oppressive and unsatisfactory. Thus, all component things are dukkha. Verse 279. Everything is without self. Sabbe dhamma anattati yada panyaya passati atha nibbindati dukkhe esa maggo visuddhiya. All states or dhammas are without self. When one sees this in wisdom, then he becomes dispassionate towards the painful. This is the path to purity. Meditation on anatta. This story is the same as the stories on anicca and dukkha. Here, the Buddha, on reflection, found that still another group of bhikkhus had meditated on insubstantiality or non-self, anatta. So he said, "Bhikkhus, all component things are insubstantial. They are not subject to one's control." Verse 280. The slothful do not realize the path. Uttahana kalam hi anuttahano yuva bali alasiyam upeto sangsanna sankappamano kusito panyaya maggang alasona vindati. Who strives not when he should strive, who, though young and strong, is given to idleness, who is loose in his purpose and thoughts, and who is lazy, that idler never finds the way to wisdom. Be vigilant and do not be idle. Once a group of young men were admitted into the order by the Buddha in Savatthi. After receiving a subject of meditation from the Buddha, all the new bhikkhus except one went to the forest to practice meditation. They practiced zealously and vigilantly, and in due course all of them attained arahanthood. Then they returned to the monastery to pay homage to the Enlightened One. Bhikkhu Tissa, who had stayed behind, did not try hard and therefore achieved nothing. When Tissa found that the other bhikkhus were so much superior to him, he regretted that he had wasted his time. So he resolved to practice meditation throughout the night. As he was walking in meditation that night, he slipped and broke a thigh bone. Other bhikkhus, hearing his cry, went to help him. On hearing about the above incident, the Buddha said, "Bhikkhus, one who does not strive when he should be striving, but idles away his time, will not attain mental absorption and purity." Verse 281. Purify thoughts, words, and deeds. Vacha nurakhi manasa susamvuta kayena cha akusalang kaira ete tayo kamma pathe visodhaye aradhaye maggang isippaveditang. Watchful of speech, well restrained in mind, let him do no evil with the body. Let him purify these three ways of action and attain the path made known by the sages. Guard your thought, word, and deed. Once, when Venerable Mahamoggallana was coming down a hill with Bhikkhu Lakkana, he saw a miserable, ever-hungry spirit, or peta, with the head of a pig and the body of a human being. On seeing the peta, Venerable Mahamoggallana just smiled in order to indicate he had seen this particular hungry ghost. Back at the monastery, when questioned by Lakkana as to why he smiled, Venerable Mahamoggallana said he saw a hungry ghost, or a peta, with its mouth swarming with maggots. The Buddha added that he himself had seen that very hungry ghost soon after his attainment of Buddhahood. Then he proceeded to relate the story about the ghost. During the time of a previous Buddha, this particular hungry ghost was a bhikkhu who often expounded the Dhamma. On one occasion, he came to a monastery where two bhikkhus were staying together. After staying with the two bhikkhus for some time, he found that the people liked his way of expounding the Dhamma. Then he thought it would be even better if he could make the two bhikkhus leave the monastery and have the place all to himself. Thus, he set one against the other. The two bhikkhus quarreled and left the monastery. On account of this evil deed, that bhikkhu had to suffer for a long time after his death. In his present existence, he was suffering as a pig-hungry ghost. Then the Buddha exhorted, "A bhikkhu should be calm and well restrained in thought, word, and deed." Verse 282. Increase your wisdom. Yoga ve jayati bhuri, ayoga bhuri sankhayo, etang dvedha pathang nyatva, bhavaya vibhavaya cha, tathattanang niveseya, yatha bhuri pavadhati. Verily, from meditation arises wisdom. Without meditation, wisdom wanes. Knowing this twofold path of gain and loss, let one so conduct oneself that wisdom may increase. Knowledge without realization is useless. Pothila. Pothila was a senior bhikkhu who knew the Dhamma well, and he taught the Dhamma to a large number of bhikkhus. Because of his knowledge, he was also conceited. The Buddha knew his weakness and wanted him to mend his ways and put him on the right path. So, whenever Pothila came to pay homage, he would address him as useless Pothila. When Pothila heard these remarks, he pondered over those words of the Buddha and came to realize that the Enlightened One had made those remarks because he had not made any serious effort to practice meditation and had not attained sainthood or even any level of mental absorption, in spite of his vast knowledge of the Dhamma. Thus, without telling anyone, he left for a monastery far away in Savatthi, where there were many bhikkhus. First, he went to the most senior bhikkhu and humbly requested him to be his mentor. But the monk, wishing to humble him, asked him to go to the next senior bhikkhu, who in turn sent him to the next. In this way he was sent from one to the other until he came to a young arahant, samanera, or novice monk. The young samanera accepted him as a pupil only after ascertaining that Pothila would obediently follow his instructions. As instructed by the samanera, Pothila kept his mind firmly fixed on the true nature of the body. He was very ardent and vigilant in his meditation. The Buddha saw Pothila in his vision, and through supernormal power sent forth his radiance and exhorted him to be steadfast and ardent in his quest for higher spiritual achievement. Soon after, Pothila attained arahanthood. Verse 283. Be without attachment. Vanang chindatha marukang, vanato jayati bhayang, chetva vanancha vanatancha, nibbana hota bhikkhavo. Cut down the forest of passions, but not real trees. From the forest of the passions springs fear. Cutting down both forest and brushwood of passions, be forestless, O bhikkhus. Verse 284. Mind is in bondage as long as there is attachment. Yavang hi vanato na chijjati, anumattopi narasa narisu, patipadha manova tava so, vacho kirapako va matari. For as long as the slightest brushwood of the passions of man towards women is not cut down, so long is his mind in bondage, like the milk calf to its mother's cow. the old monks and the old woman. Once in Savatthi, there were 5 friends who became bhikkhus only in their old age. These 5 bhikkhus were in the habit of going together to their old homes for alms food. Of their former wives, one lady in particular was a good cook, and she looked after them well. Thus, the 5 bhikkhus went mostly to her house. But one day she fell ill and died suddenly. The old bhikkhus felt their loss very deeply, and together they cried, praising her virtues and lamenting their loss. The Buddha admonished them, "Bhikkhus, you all are feeling pain and sorrow because you are not free from greed, hatred, and ignorance, which are like a great forest. Cut down this forest, and you will be freed from these mental impurities." Verse 285. Develop the path of peace. Uchinda sinehang attano, kumudang saratikang va panina, santi maggang eva bruhaya, nibbanang sugatena desitang. Cut off your affection, as though it were an autumn lily, with the hand. Cultivate the very path of peace. Nibbana has been expounded by the Auspicious One. Meditation on a lotus flower. Once, a young son of a goldsmith was admitted into the holy order by Venerable Sariputta. After receiving impurity of the body as the subject of meditation from Venerable Sariputta, he left for the forest to practice meditation there. He did not make any progress, so he returned twice to Sariputta for further instructions. Still he made no progress. So the Venerable Sariputta took the bhikkhu to see the Enlightened One. The Buddha knew that he was the son of a goldsmith. He had been born in the family of goldsmiths during several past existences. Therefore, the Buddha changed the subject of meditation for the bhikkhu. Instead of loathsomeness, he was directed to meditate on pleasantness. With his supernormal power, the Buddha created a beautiful lotus flower and told him to stick it in a mound of sand just outside the monastery. The bhikkhu, concentrating on the big, beautiful, fragrant lotus flower, was able to get rid of the hindrances. He was filled with delightful satisfaction, and gradually he progressed until he reached as far as the 4th level of mental absorption. The Buddha saw him from his room, and with his supernormal power made the flower wither instantly. Seeing the flower wither and change its color, the bhikkhu perceived the impermanent nature of the flower and all other conditioned things. That led to the realization of the impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, and the insubstantiality of all conditioned things. At that instant, the Buddha sent forth his radiance and exhorted the bhikkhu to get rid of craving or tanha. Reflecting mindfully on the exhortation, he attained arahanthood. Verse 286. The ignorant realize not the nature of death. Idha vassang vasissami, idha hemanta gimhi su, iti balo vichinteti, antarayang na bujjhati. Here will I live in the rainy season. Here will I live in the cold season and the hot season. So imagines the fool, not realizing the danger of approaching death. A wealthy merchant's impending death. Mahadhana Once, Mahadhana, a merchant from Benares, came to Savatthi during a festival to sell his textiles and other merchandise. When he reached the river bank near Savatthi, he could not cross the river as it was flooded. He was held back for 7 days by the flood. By that time the festival was over. Since he did not want to return to Benares with his merchandise, he decided to spend some time in Savatthi to sell off his goods. One day, the Buddha, while going on an alms round, saw the merchant and he smiled. Ananda questioned the Buddha on why he smiled, and the Buddha replied, "Ananda, do you see that merchant? He is thinking that he can stay here and sell his goods. He is not aware that the end of his life is very near. What should be done today. To live just one night, mindful, energetic, and not disturbed by moral defilements, is to have had a well-spent life." On the instruction of the Buddha, Ananda advised Mahadhana to practice mindfulness instead of being negligent. On learning about his impending death, Mahadhana was alarmed and frightened. So, for 7 days he invited the Buddha and other bhikkhus for alms food and requested the Enlightened One to expound the Dhamma to help him to gain freedom from samsara. After listening to the sermons given by the Buddha, Mahadhana attained the first stage of sainthood. Upon his death, he was reborn in the Tushita Deva world. Verse 287. Death seizes the doting man. Tang putta pasu sammatang vyasatta manasang narang sutang gamang mahoghonva machu adaya gacchati. The man who dotes on his children and his herds of cattle, whose mind longs for and is attached to sensual pleasures, is carried away by death, even as a sleeping village is swept away by a great flood. Death comes to all beings. Kisa Gotami. Kisa Gotami had come to the Buddha as she was stricken with grief due to the death of her only son. The Buddha said, "Kisa Gotami, do you think you are the only one who has lost a son? Death comes to all beings. Before their desires are satiated, death takes them away." She was consoled by the Buddha's advice. This story is also reflected in chapter 8 as the background story of verse 114. Verses 288 and 289. No protection at the moment of death. Nasanti putta tanaya, na pita na pi bandhava, antakena dipannas nathinyatisu tanata, etang atthavasang nyatva, pandito sila sangvuto, nibbana gamanang magga, hippangeva visuddhaye. There are no sons for one's protection, neither father nor even kinsman. For one who is overcome by death, no protection is to be found among kinsmen. Realizing this fact, let the virtuous and wise person swiftly clear the way that leads to Nibbana. Sons and daughters are no refuge. Patachara. As Patachara had lost her husband and her 2 sons, as well as her parents and only brother almost at the same time, She was driven to near insanity. When she approached the Buddha, he consoled her. Patachara, sons and daughters cannot look after you. Even if they are alive, they don't exist for you. The wise observes morality or sila and clears the obstacles to the path leading to Nibbana. Patachara managed to overcome her sorrows through the comforting words of the Buddha.